Yes.
Good morning. Good morning, Your Holiness. I hope you had a good rest, maybe even direct perception of dreams. Yesterday we have...
No dream.
No dream. So no bad dreams. Yesterday we were covering more the overview of where attention is placed within Western psychology, and we heard about the idea of multitasking, of the different ideas, how attention is happening. But particularly we also were hearing then afterwards in the afternoon Alan's presentation about the general place of attention in the Buddhist framework. And I'm very honored to announce today the presentation of Anne Treisman. She's professor at Princeton University, at the Department of Psychology, and she is considered to be the most eminent and like the grand dame of attention research. She has been doing research in the West probably the longest of everybody that we are at least aware of, and has been accordingly awarded many honors and many prizes for her outstanding research. And we're going to be looking into what is actually attention. Yesterday we were framing it, and today we're going to be looking at it from different angles. And one of the topics that already came up in yesterday's discussion was the binding problem. And
Binding problem.
Binding.
Would you like to explain that?
I'll explain it later.
Yes. She will be explaining, and I was just reaching a bit out to what we're going to be hearing today. So, Anne, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'm greatly honoured to be one of the presenters at this wonderful occasion and to have the chance to talk to Your Holiness. I hope I'll manage to make my talk intelligible and interesting to you. And I should say from the start that it's a talk from an outsider. I'm not familiar with, I'm not very familiar anyway, with much of Buddhist theories. I'll try to present to you the Western psychology approach. I'm certainly one who's eager to learn more about the Buddhist approach. So I'm interested in exploring the possible interactions between Buddhist accounts of attention based on meditation and introspection and Western psychological accounts based on experiments and observation from the outside of behavior and of the brain. Can we talk to each other, or are the findings, as it were, in different languages? Do they raise the so-called hard philosophical problems of relating brain and mind? Could there be findings in the Western approach which are incompatible with Buddhism? And similarly, could there be findings in Western theories that conflict with what the Buddhists claim? I'm not sure that there could be such conflicts, because the questions and methods, I think, are different. We use the third person rather than the first person, as Alan described yesterday. But I think that raises a problem not so much in the sense that Alan was arguing. As he said, psychologists very much use the first person. We rely on our subjects to report what they are experiencing. But I think we use these reports differently from the way they're used in Buddhist psychology. We use them as data to be explained and interpreted rather than as factual reports. These are one way of linking the two. Yes?
Did you want to do one?
This also.
Can you close the curtain there? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I cannot see. Beautiful face.
Okay. So one way of linking the two is to look for neural or behavioral correlates of what meditators report experiencing. Another bridge might be to explore how long-term experience affects the kinds of attention tasks that we study in the West. And we have collected some preliminary data on that question. These are important methods for psychologists, I think. I'd also be very interested to know what Buddhist psychology, what Buddhist psychology hopes to get from us. I think that's an important question. Attention is a...
Tseribe chilone su teje lyugun lunga nam juda and lebe nam jutone the chigores the chitigolta jebe ngommen rawa inza and ku tutuni buti tumbadama tumbegen jobe jingurwas and ne dandi jikchina ya 공군요 저도 여든이 든데 이제 템베 갑라야 이래서 템베 갑라야 그 레베 남주 간다 요마에 같은 따제 디토네야 tunjonrupe yung sigres maza nangbe samnuribage samnurchenegi nubjoge samnurchenene chu lejalaege ya dumbarbo karkar yonas.
Can you tell me if I am speaking too quickly? That's okay, good. One important... The words, yes. Oh, I try. Yes, I tried to avoid them, but it's difficult to avoid jargon completely. One important difference, I think, is that the kinds of mechanisms that psychologists hypothesize are often not directly available to us to think about. We can't introspect them. So we infer them to make sense of observations of behavior rather than looking inward directly to access them. The findings I'll describe first on focused attention, I think, will illustrate this difference. So coming back to attention, it's a good topic to explore, I think, because it's at the heart of meditation. Studies of attention also raise some big questions which are relevant both to Buddhist psychology and to Western psychology. The first one that I want to talk about is what are the effects of different modes of attention? Secondly, what kind...
What do you mean by
I'll explain. I'll explain. Yes. What kinds of things can we become aware of, and what kinds of things remain inaccessible to our minds, and why?
간사되게 뇌망에 가시에다 유간다 가이네 가시에 뇌두 가시에 나만 가시에 뇌두고요 말아 다 템버때 맞던
So I'm going to talk both about attention and about consciousness and try and give examples of some research in each field. First, to outline the methods that we use. Psychologists study attention by using tasks that seem to capture some essentials of the everyday examples, but put them in a controlled setting where we can keep control of the different variables. So we measure the latencies of response, how fast people can do things, and the kinds of errors that they make, and try to work out what the underlying mental processes might be. So we also look at activation in different areas of the brain, and we study the changes in performance that patients with damage in particular areas will show.
Attention law. My attention to Illusory.
attention down things and
또 되니샤시비는 듬벨이 말해.
듬벨레그로 나오.
듬바.
근데 일을 쉬어서지. 코믹스 듬버chen 되니 예매네. 되니 예매 참.
가시 라운 매봐요. 그래서 attention 도게 그러와. 라운 듬바 매봐지.
가서 쉐베 미버스라고 질이야. 쉐베 떠버리야. 일을 쉐베 내가 치고.
레고를 나름. 되네 템버
듬베 되니 계속 가게 봐.
요 말에.
또 아직 되베 되니 가게 봐.
요 말에. 되네 템버 말. 네.
안 돼디 듬버 쉬실 계시고.
Yes. He's always wondering.
일을 쉬실 계시고. 일을 쉬실 계시야 알았어.
Stand 그 템버 맞잖아.
냠 숙취하실 레베이나.
템버 냠 볼래나 일집 죽으면 레그로. 일집가 간다. 셈미고라 균데 내야데 템베치레라 봐.
Translation with in Tibetan.
Attention date 일집가 샤베나 템버요나. 아니
일을 좀 잡아 봐.
말다. 템버요나. 아니 일집도 주르고 대토고 봐. 셈미고라야. 도마 유도 셰버 체베 갈바야 일집가 용구요르데 이네 고 템버매나 고 나라망에 소리지마도 고는 게 시된 동말 봐.
Chena attention da yila jeba bet dun chi ma de dingen sen da wa shuk chimba yode dingen sen
또 이들 떠서 하지.
Never.
never. 떠서 디브시.
나를.
dire dingen sen ma de
패지 러시아. 유치라고 들어. 일치를 롯데.
나를.
봐. 롯데에 유텔이야. 떠서 하던 내야
situation
Things in that.
What we're really thrashing through here is just the technical terminology and invite you into this, because none of us feel, I think, that there's a direct equivalence between the Sanskrit term manasikara or yidacheva in Tibetan. It's not quite a direct match with attention. Overlap, but at least His Holiness and I are not persuaded it's equivalent. There's voluntary attention, in which you have this notion of yearning or aspiration that comes in, but not all attention is voluntary. But there's this very common term samadhi, and samadhi does not always mean a high level of focus attention. It's simply a mental factor.
And so,
I can explain very easily. So when speaking of shamatha, we're speaking of really developing very enhanced states of very focused, sustained, vivid attention. We're not talking about that, but there's simply the mental factor that we already have. And so what shamatha is, this whole matrix of practices of shamatha, is taking a faculty you already have, let's call it samadhi, and let's say this is attention, and it's developing it to higher and higher levels. It's enhancing, refining it, developing it. But we already have samadhi. In the Buddhist psychology, we already have a samadhi. It's not something you get later. It's something you may or may not develop. And so my own feeling is there's a very focus.
Samadhi.
Shine shamatha.
Shamatha. No.
Samadhi really just means focused attention. But all attention is focused in a manner of speaking. I think we should probably get back to Anne because the time is
I
going.
hope that some of this will become clearer as I give examples. I'm not surprised that it raises problems, because people in the West argue for many, many hours over what the meaning of attention is. And I don't think it's a single thing. I don't think it's one faculty. But you will see how I am using it by the experiments that I describe. Okay. So different modes of attention. I said I would explain modes. This is ways of deploying attentions, whether we're going to spread it broadly, distribute it across a whole scene, try and take in everything that's in front of us, or do we focus narrowly onto one thing, like my computer here? And what effects does that have on what we perceive? Do we get different information when attention is spread broadly and when it is narrowly focused? Okay. And we can also compare attention when it's directed outward to things in the world and when it's directed inward to ideas, mental calculations, thoughts, and so on. Then the second part of the talk will be on, as I said, on consciousness, explicit awareness, which means we have available to us to introspect the information that we're talking about, but we also We also have much knowledge that seems to be implicit, to which we do not have access. One of the questions would be how far you can get access to this implicit information through meditation. And we can ask, can unconscious stimuli affect our behavior? Finally, I was going to describe some experiments that we did on experienced meditators to see how their attention is changed by that experience. Okay. Here is an outline of my talk. So I'll start off by describing how different modes of attention, whether it's broadly spread or narrowly focused, affect what becomes consciously available to us. I'll then go on and talk about explicit awareness or implicit knowledge, that's consciousness. Does attention affect only what we can experience with knowledge, or can unconscious stimuli also affect our behavior? And then, as I said, I'll describe some experiments on the effects of meditation on attention, and finally come back to some open questions, which I hope we can discuss. So, modes of attention, ways of directing attention. First, focused attention. This is the narrow focus. It's what people in the West usually mean by attention, I think. When you're attending to something, you're narrowing down and looking exclusively at that or listening to it. So it's like a spotlight focused on one object. I've been interested in what kinds of information we get. So with focused attention, we certainly get more detail. We can also exclude interference from irrelevant material. This is one important function, I think, of focused attention. And the third one, I think, is less obvious because it's not available to introspection. So this is one where I have done some research, and I'd like just to describe it to you and explain it to you. When we look around the world, we experience integrated objects, whole objects with all their properties, shape, color, orientation, size, distance, and so on. So we might see a red car moving down the hill, and we get the whole thing as a single unified experience. But both behavioral and neural evidence suggests that different visual properties, like shape, size, color, motion, and so on, actually are analyzed separately in the brain. Neuroscientists have found different populations of neurons in the brain, different cells in the brain that respond in a specialized way to different types of change, like something moving, something color, in different areas of the brain. We can also see it in patients with brain damage that's localized in different areas. They may selectively lose the ability to see motion, for example. So one patient was unable to see motion. He'd just see a series of still photographs. If he were looking at a car driving along, he'd see it here, then here, then here. Water being poured from a teapot looked like icicles hanging down. Another patient, for example, might lose the ability to see color, and the world would simply be in black and gray and white. And the areas that are damaged are in different parts of the brain. So it seems as if the visual system represents each of these different properties at least partly independently of the others. So it seems as if the brain takes the stimulus apart in a fragmented, distributed form. So this is what I just said. We can also attend selectively to particular properties, so I can look around at the different colors in the room, or whether anyone is moving, and so on. So again, that suggests independent processing. So this raises the binding problem. How do we recombine these properties to make an integrated object, which is what we experience? Consciousness is full of unitary integrated objects. How come, given that the brain has separated out all the different properties. How do we put them together again? That's known as the binding problem.
لا هذا ضمن كيف ده بنا دودي بالنمبر شيء عند رابش تاير وانشي يوتيوب تادي تاما نمبر كي تورو سوي توصل سوغورو ده كان binding problem.
공화 체세가 되죠. 직선.
순진님의 발랄. 나선님의 발랄. 나를.
근데 지금 거로 중소한
거. So His Holiness was saying that there's a parallel problem raised in the Buddhist epistemological discourse about how perceptions represent the sense data when it perceives objects, and there were 3 different positions taken, and the position that has been favored is really seen as, although the world that is experienced is that of multiplicity, but the actual experience is a unity.
Yes, that's exactly the binding problem. How do we reach that unity, I think? So this is something that I have been doing research on. And I made a very simple suggestion, which was that we just we use focused attention, attend to each object in turn, and then we can put together, combine the features that are currently in the focus of attention. Okay, now this is not something that you can introspect. It happens below the level of consciousness.
그래다 근데 가서 그러는 것도 좀 말아. 되게 넘버 타대 봐 여봐 되게 넘버 직 소유자네. 명회 직리야. 진짜 거 같다.
또미 보라를.
나스.
또미 직 유리 차산시지.
나래.
그봐. 아, 다 또게 되는 직 초초시.
나래. So another distinction that is made in Buddhist epistemology is the way in which sensory perceptions engage with object, and where thoughts mediated through concepts engage. Thoughts are much more selective. They can just pick one property.
That's right, yes. This is like what I called attending selectively to the color or to the motion. So,
whereas the sensory perceptions are thought to be much more direct and unmediated through concepts.
Then you wouldn't be using attention. You would just passively allow information to come in.
자상 attention 사디 일치ව 사디 도미시벌 일치지 더벌 일치 소소스입니다.
나래. So
또보도미 요시월이 쉬운 거래시 내가지. 다른 것들이 또보도미 요치고.
요말에
디 직치고.
So
레벨톤을 시작했을 거예요. 다들 레벨 켜서 시작했다.
나래.
지금 이 과야지. 다들 이게 맞아.
So from the Buddhist point of view, a very important distinction is made, fundamental distinction is drawn between kind of thoughts or mental level cognition, which are mediated through concepts and language, on the one hand, and bare sensory experiences. And it seems that in the Western epistemological and psychological model, that fundamental distinction doesn't seem to have been made.
Oh, I think it is.
You think?
Yes, I mean, we talk very much about top-down effects. Top-down means from high up on the sensory input, and how perception comes from the interaction of the two. So I think this is very much in our tradition as well. So it's interesting.
So one can make distinctions on the basis of the brain correspondence as well, correlations?
Yes. So early visual areas would mainly respond to the sensory, and then you can see the frontal cortex sending messages down.
Dan moshadana ji chebena an wangshelia bet shibujirakwa ngasa mado sham dige changma tokpakon duya mari peche.
It's only a bit more to translate, because there's this very kind of primitive level of attention that is called, we call mental engagement, manasikara, but it's a very primitive level. There are higher levels, much more engaged and cognitive levels of attention, where we're going more into the realm of samadhi and then sustained with mindfulness. His Holiness was commenting for this very primitive level of attention and the initial engagement of the mind with an object. This occurs both in perceptual or non-conceptual and conceptual modes of cognition, so it's common to both. But introspectively, one does draw a distinction that addresses the issue of binding in terms of our direct perceptual, which is to say non-conceptual apprehension of the world. We're just getting a multiplicity of qualia.
Right.
of impressions coming in that just by straight perception itself do not bind themselves into objects that
I'll
have
show you
qualities.
this. Yes.
This is from the Buddha side.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm looking here, and I'm not just seeing a pattern of appearances,
Right.
but I'm seeing a professor and so forth.
Right.
And so what configures the sensory appearances, the qualia, into objects is the configuration, the conditioning by concept, drawing from memory and so forth. This congeals the appearances into an object that has qualities.
Yes.
And so this topic is not left out on the Buddha side, and I think it's not entirely inaccessible to introspection either. But now what are the brain correlates? Well, for that, then we Buddhists, then we're quiet.
Yes.
And we're listening to the brain scientists, what you have to say.
Okay. So if this suggestion is correct, then one prediction is that we should make errors. We should put the different features together in the wrong combinations when attention is overloaded or when it's diverted to other things. So I'll see if I can demonstrate that. What we did was we showed subjects displays like this, 2 black digits and 3 colored letters in between. And we told them they must get the digits correct. They must tell us, for example, 7 and 4 were at each end. And then also tell us what colored letters they saw. Okay, so they're spreading attention, which means, according to my theory, they might have trouble binding the colors and the shapes. And that's, in fact, what we found. So let me just show you an example. I will flash briefly another string like this, and then follow it with what we call a mask, which interrupts perception of that. It's a lot of colored lines. You should get the digits correct, the 2 digits on each end, and also tell me what colored letters you saw. Okay, ready?
대중을 땡겨줘봐. 다들 들으셔. 안경이 버룰이야. 이게 숨체. 이게 숨그 천도 담다체. 아니 디버룰이야. 다 바로 주는 얘기.
So shall I show that again? Or okay, ready? Now, the digits were 3 and 7. I hope you got those right. And then here are the colored letters. Now, when I normally show this to an audience, usually 1/3 of them get an illusory conjunction. That is, they say, I saw a red O or a green T. And I was subject to this. I was testing my theory many years ago, and I said, oh, it doesn't work. I can see everything perfectly. And my research assistant was laughing because she said, I'm making many, many of those binding errors. This, I think, suggests that bind...
So this is really measuring your ability to conceptually identify, not simply conceptually identify colors and letters. So you're getting a visual impression, but also then...
Yeah, you have to go down and get the letters.
Brevity with which you can conceptually ascertain.
Right. So it does seem as if... Sorry. It seems as if binding is a real problem for the brain. I mean, it is something that the brain has to solve in order to see the world correctly.
Solens was wondering whether it is a function of how fast the person's thought process is, or whether it is how fast the actual perceptual process is.
Right.
So what would be your take on this?
I'm not sure I would distinguish. I think there's a continuum of different stages, and where you make the conceptual start and the sensory stop is not always clear.
So Solens was wondering whether he could ask a question.
Of course.
Is that difference?
그는 미지가
나래.
미지기 그는 로주 권을 그 열로 찍대.
나래.
전에 로주양 주치비시고 열로 시대에 개발됩니다.
Would you see a difference, within an individual due to age? Say, for example, is exposed to this experiment 10 years before and has performed it, and then after 10 years, so will the age make a difference?
I haven't found age differences. I haven't looked specifically for it. Children show these, so do adults, and I don't think I'm showing more as I get older. I think I'm the same age as Your Holiness. So other things change with age, but...
여기는 원부시를 들어왔어요.
나래.
이로 또가 로야 개비니 또가 So
the reason why His Holiness asked that question is that if there is a difference due to age, then it's very much related to the sensory process.
Yeah.
Because as you all get older, the sensory processes weaken.
Yes, they do, and in many ways, but I don't think this is one of them.
But if it is a level of mental thought level, then even when you are older, so long as you have trained your mind, you can still retain it quite sharp.
That's right, which is a comfort.
Comfort that it seems to the others. His Holiness was saying for the oldies.
So we also get more evidence from Valence patients. Now, Valence patients are very unfortunate people, but luckily very rare. It doesn't often happen. They have damage to both parietal lobes, so both lobes here and here. And we studied one of these patients. He had a stroke on one side and then a subsequent stroke on the other side, almost symmetrical. They are unable to localize objects, so they don't know where things are at all. If you ask them, is an X at the top or bottom of the screen, left or right, they have no idea. And they're also unable to shift attention around. They can't move attention. So they should have a lot of trouble with binding, was my prediction, and our patient did. So we would show him simple displays like this, just 2 colored letters, and ask him what he saw, and we could leave it up for 10 seconds, not quickly. And he would be almost as likely to say he saw a green X as that he saw a green O. Really, he had big problems with binding. So it seems that seeing integrated objects with their features bound in the correct combinations is an important function for focused attention. This patient had lost the ability to focus attention, and he saw many illusory conjunctions. I think the binding problem does not apply only to perception. Your Holiness was asking about, is it a conceptual problem? And I think it is, although I haven't studied it so much. The perceptual form is the one that's easiest to do experiments with, but I think it's a much more general issue. In order to think at all, we need to bring together different concepts to form an integrated idea. And I think attention is involved in creating and maintaining this complex web of ideas, keeping a higher order structure in mind and in memory while we work on it. In fact, one of the most common kinds of memory errors, of mistakes that we make in memory, consists of losing the correct associations between features and ideas. So, okay, so I'll go on to...
attention mipo te ko sem mipo te je ani di jewa yo de be ge 20 ge de su ru so je en pension tunjo yo ba de tunjo de ge nam ye che je sam dang ko ba de di to ba le kang de te mo de kan zu experiment che to tan de tal che to yo ma res ka so wang she le de mi ge tong ye de che da je che de yo ba.
So this is just a summary of what I've been saying. I like to think of perception as a kind of externally guided hallucination. So we get some information in a very discrete form. It's much less like photography than we would think. And we create an experience from that. So we see some red, we see an X, and we put them together with the right amount of red to fill the X. So let's move on now to distributed or global attention. That's spread over a lot of different objects in the world. What effect? Sorry? I know, yeah. What effect does that have on perception? It'll allow you to see the global shape. For example, you can here see the T and the H, as well as the S and the C. So with distributed attention, you see the large letters. With focused attention, you see the small ones. It will allow you to see that these dots are homogeneous, so you can take them all in. They're all green, except one is red now. It also, I think, gives you the gist of a scene. For example, you can, with a brief flash, you can see that there's a beach there or a shopping center. So, for example, if I show you that briefly, you probably all saw a mountain scene. Here you saw a kitchen. And this puzzled me a little because how can we do this if we have to bind the features one by one? We don't see each object coming up successively as we move attention around. Yet the pictures in natural scenes are much more complex than a single red X and green S and so on. But they seem to be identified much faster when I just flash the pictures up. A possible solution was that people might be responding simply to the presence of features without binding them together into objects. And we decided to test this by seeing what people actually knew when they'd seen some flashed pictures. What could they tell us? So we used the task of asking people, is there an animal present in the scene? So if I show you this one, you'll say, yes, there's an animal. I'd like you to look for any animal, including bird, fish, insect, and so on, in the following sequence. If I can get this to work. Okay. Ready? Was there an animal? Anybody see an animal? Here, I'll show you them slowly. There. So that was what you saw very quickly. In fact, people can do it. About 80% of the time, they see the animal correctly. However, what we did was try to find out how much they had seen, how much they knew. And we asked them, which was the animal? What was it? Was it a bear or a snake or a butterfly? And they usually knew the general category, but they didn't know, they couldn't tell a bear from a cow, for example. And also, they didn't know where in the picture it was. So left, right, or center, they didn't know. So it seems as if that's what we would expect, I think, if all the information they had was in the form of unbound features, just features coming in. Yeah.
So it's always wondering because the images that you have, the images that you have shown all seem to have kind of quite a large background scene.
Yeah.
So what would you say if you show more focused objects, just very quickly,
yes.
The same speed?
Yeah, yeah. It is a little easier, but probably not much. I think the same would happen, that they would get about 80% of the... I mean, people have done that experiment. Right. It's an interesting one. But, yeah.
And I was wondering if an evolutionary biologist watched that. I was wondering immediately, I saw a human being. Now, do you want to count that as an animal or not?
Well, we actually tried seeing whether that made it harder. So we had slides with human beings, and it was much harder for them to get the animals.
But, but that's the point.
Yeah.
evolutionists think of a human being as an animal.
Yeah.
So I was saying
Yeah.
that's an animal.
So we share a lot
in
of
your
features with animals. We have legs and hair and so on. Yeah. So, okay. Another suggestion is that distributed attention.
His Holiness feels that there ought to be difference because
그런데 잘 맞으면서 두 스텝이니.
Yeah.
또밀 쳐서 나버리지. 또왜 되는 이 주로.
because
내가 충분히 이메이나 그저 욕심이 있는 딱그 유지라.
Yeah.
because if there's only one
또밀 나한테면 나네. 원비셔를 나한테면 나네. 도루게 와가해요.
Right. The binding problem might be easier. Yes.
because the thing
Yeah.
is there's only one object
Yes,
in front
right.
of you,
Yeah.
even though the speed may be
No,
the
you're
same.
quite right, and I think it would be a little easier, but it's not a big effect, I think,
I know.
of having the scene there.
Definitely not. No.
Okay, so distributed or global attention might also form a summary of the scene. Just summarize it, give us the average size, shape, color, and so on of the objects present. So when I look at a plant, I'm not very interested in the shape of every leaf. I want to know the average shape of the leaf and compare this, for example, with these, with these. And when I look at the scene with the flock of birds, I'm not so interested in each individual bird. I want to know that they're all the same species. Perhaps I need to know the typical bird. I need to abstract from it an average shape. If we try and simplify this to put it in the lab, we can ask people to judge the average size of some circles like this. And we find that people are very good at it. So, for example, if I show you this and then show you this, I can ask you two different questions. I can say, was this circle in the scene that I just showed you? Is it one of the ones that I showed you, the exact circle? And people are very bad at that, and they're worse if you have more circles. Excuse me. But if I ask you instead, is this larger or smaller than the average size of the display I just showed you? You're very good at it. People can do that easily. So it seems as if we abstract the average size from a whole display. And this looks very different from what you would predict if statistical averaging depended on focused attention. It doesn't matter how long you show the display. People get the average very quickly. We tried getting people to average some shapes like this. So if you look at this, now I can ask you, was this shape in the preceding display? People are saying yes. No, but the typical answer was yes, because it's the average of the previous shapes. Was this shape in the preceding display? Any offers? Yes, but the typical answer was no. People don't remember individual instances when several are presented at once. They just remember the average or the typical shape. Does this require focused attention? Yeah.
저 누구 땡기지 그냥 레벨 있나? 패지양 또부터
둥글이라래.
아도 되게 이제 도심이 있나? 딩 그냥 어디 재면나? 또 나오면 되고.
So surely there will be a difference between whether you warn people or not.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, in the experiment, they get many, many trials, and they know what they're doing, yes.
Yeah. Because if they're warned, then the mind is being kind of more vigilant. And,
yeah,
you know,
and it helps a little, but not much. Yeah. I could show you the data, but I can just tell you now. So, does it depend on focused attention? Can we do another task at the same time? As David talked about task switching, trading one against another. When we asked people to look for a letter among digits, so here they're looking for the B, and then we tested them on the shapes. Was this shape presented or not? We found they were just as good at getting the average shape when they were also doing the letter and digit task. So it doesn't seem to require focused attention. Okay, it doesn't conflict.
keju chirabaji duje yu chirabaji duje tel focus te chigbe kone de dan jigdan ya jiong 진짜 니도스 다 디릭들이야 인지미지 미고 chirabaji ten dugu mebe 다다가 있으나 무시 내가 제야 될이야 답변은 이거다 아니 안기디기들 뭐에서 맞아 슬라비어데 아니 이 냠볼이야 수년담도 고샤버데 제일 Vegetative 롭소야 뭐 잡두고도 된서 그 미고 chirabaji야
초상태에서
때 마대be 소리지 근데 미고도 지용이야 지 담제 대고 옆에 소리지 디다 좁더럽지.
So these are examples of the kind of information we can get.
And am I right
I'm sorry.
thinking that if it is the selective focus that is involved here, then they shouldn't be able to get the shape?
That's right. At the same time as getting the digit among the letters, yeah. So these are examples of the kinds of information that we can get when we vary the conditions of perception and look at the kinds of errors that people make and the time they take to report things and so on. A third way to deploy attention is to direct it inward towards mental processes, thoughts or ideas, instead of outward. I've just been talking about outward so far. I wondered whether there's anything comparable in Buddhist psychology. So in an experiment, this wasn't work by me, but someone else compared doing an internal task, like adding 1 to each of 4 digits. So if I tell you 5281, you would have to say 6392. You added 1 to each of the previous digits. It's quite a difficult task. It requires a lot of attention. Could you combine that with an external task, looking for a letter K in a stream of rapid letters? And what they found was that while you're actually doing the mental arithmetic, not while you're hearing the digits, but while you're doing the mental arithmetic, you've gone internal, you are much more likely to miss the K than when you're just...
이루간다 안게페나 나니 게직슬랍 델리아니 안게 르리아 네베르 잡제 말랍다슬라베나 다 툭숨 니슬라고 거봐 다들 아니 삼노탕베 링갈이야 아니 이게 담에다 망보시 되는지 디나노를 깨 가지고 여부터 뭔지 맞춰스
아래
라베나 다티주니
더블 내가
더블 내가 신다 싶고시하러 다티주니 게임 나 망보시 게임 망보시 메시지도 주마도 그지 Yeah, that makes sense, yeah.
So it looks as if the two are in competition. It's difficult to direct attention inward and outward at the same time. So let's go back to the outline and look at the effects of consciousness and on behavior and so on. Is the role of attention limited to conscious perception and thought? There are many recent studies on both normal people and patients with brain damage, which have shown that behavior and brains can be affected by cues in the environment of which we are quite unaware. So is watching people...
You want to explain cues?
Yeah.
Like
Cue, any
signs,
external stimulus
yeah.
influence. I'll give examples. Is watching people do a less reliable guide to what's in their minds than we had thought. Let's just see. These are some new questions that we're asking. Is attention limited to controlling conscious thoughts, or are there also effects on unconscious thoughts? And can access to unconscious thoughts be improved through meditation? So here's one experiment. You make up a sentence that uses the following sets of words. Wrinkles, forgetful, short-sighted, retirement, or another group of subjects has apples, awkward, breezy, marketing. Obviously, the first set evokes images of old people, and the other one evokes only random associations. Now, the experiment consisted...
make an open number, Lord Chagrava. The Tsunang Taman Devamet in Janarjinza and Cololia, Karchak to Slatulamsan, Tichak to Servi. Yomares.
So now the measure in the experiment was nothing to do with this. They just compared.
This may have more to do with the habituation of how words are associated with certain types of images.
It's certainly using associations, yes. All they did was measure how fast the subjects walked down the corridor to the next experiment after doing this experiment. What they found was that the people who had the wrinkles, forgetful and so on, walked more slowly down the corridor than the people who had the random set of words.
Experiment shoga chilia making go namjutan de yote tsikike pejoche sunang de chilia and shibut pejoche ti shugute an experiment sabada ta ko the lab ne mathong ko ba and corridor na drive kapya that ji panjam ro drive kapya the making go den de yote ni tsik experiment chi ke ko ba je de de slow check this ti shukin ro.
The interesting thing, of course, was that they were quite unaware that they were walking more slowly or why they were walking more slowly. Also, in a later test for memory for the room in which they had been tested, they were more forgetful.
So this has been repeated many times.
Oh,
this
yes.
is not just once or
yeah,
twice.
it's one example of many, many experiments as well.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's only
I didn't believe it at
it's
first.
been replicated many times.
Yeah, I didn't believe it, but I think many people have replicated this and many other experiments. So in a later test of memory for the room in which the experiment was run, they were significantly more forgetful than the people with the neutral words.
Jengege da kan the experiment chebe kabla da gengo da dewa yote geba da dewa yote tik bejo chesa jorba kunzu ji temba ge de jorji dine kabde
kanza
jengege cheorji.
In another study,
groups of students.
In another study, groups of students filled out forms. One group did so while they were sitting near a computer monitor that had this picture, fish, tropical fish floating by. They weren't told to look at it. It had nothing to do with the task they were given. Another group had...
The myths miselavio maris computer screen kan tija shaje experiment is a room to naroya.
And then they gave them various tests, and the effects of the dollar bills were substantial and surprising. They tended to make people into extreme individualists, more reluctant to ask help from others, and more reluctant to offer help. For example, when each participant had to pull up a chair to talk to a stranger, those who had done the paperwork near the dollar bills put their chairs nearly 50% further away from the strangers than those who'd worked near the fish. When they were given a puzzle that was difficult to solve, the people who had sat near the money worked for much longer, twice as long, as the people who'd worked near the fish to solve the problem before they asked for help. Evidently, words and images related to money can automatically trigger self-centered actions. In no case was anyone consciously aware of any influence from the screensaver dollar bills. In the field of attention research, we also find evidence of unconscious processes in the absence of awareness. Being able to spy on the brain using...
unconscious.
So in one experiment using a selective attention task, people looked at faces. So each of these pictures has a face in the center and a house in the surround. Okay? And they were told to attend to the faces in the center, and they had to detect whether any face was repeated, okay, whether they saw the same face twice. Meanwhile, in one group, the houses were often repeated. There were only 2 houses which were alternating. And in the other group, they were all new houses. Okay, nobody could report anything about the houses because they were studying the faces closely. The question is, are the houses having any effect in the brain that suggests that they are being analyzed? And the answer is yes. In the brain area that is specialized for houses, so this pink areas here respond selectively to places, houses, general spaces like that. The blue areas respond to faces, so they're separate in the brain, and you can look and see what's going on. And what they found was that even when they were not aware of the houses repeating or changing, the house area was. So it responded more strongly when the houses were changing.
No. 레벨 담미가 돈되고 하는 거. 미 동보다 강보다 사간다 근데 통표급기 레벨 자세로 대자디 일제버디 왕셰게 내가래 샤종녀로지 가도 kopike 지통되게 돼
이러지도 이거
나래
일치만도 일치만도 유절 때버지 일치만은 통마로
나래 then could you attention you go to your second medicine guys because this is partly again an internal discussion here. The Buddhist term manaskara, which is what we are translating as attention, and although there's a problem here, is an omnipresent mental factor which is thought to be present in any cognitive process, whether perceptual or conceptual. So which would suggest even in the case of someone viewing this scene, there will be some attention present.
Going to the
to the house.
To the houses, yes. Yeah. But they were unable to report
so
the
from
houses.
The modern Western scientific point of view, would you also say that there is some degree of attention being paid to the house?
It depends how you define attention. Clearly the brain is discriminating, so the brain is paying some attention to the houses.
So in Buddhist psychology and in Buddhist psychology there is an understanding that whatever is familiar, the mind will be faster to attend to it.
Yeah.
So, for example, within the environment, compared to environment like a house or place, and human beings, the familiarity with human beings will be, stronger, so that we'll be able to attend to human beings much faster.
Yes, that's a good point.
Than an inanimate object.
Yeah, it would be interesting to do the experiment the reverse way around. You put the house in the center and attend to the houses, and see whether people respond to the face, whether the brain recognizes the faces are changing.
Experiment chena kenza medros. Tanda musidi 동발다 쓰라봐. 다디 코돈. 디 기대 강바드샤. 강바들 미고대야 슬랍. 예연이야 미 동바샤베나. 야 레베 직 데리아.
Yes, it's a good point, Your Holiness. Yeah. So far, I've given examples from normal, healthy people, but there are even more striking examples of unawareness in patients with brain lesions in particular areas of the brain. Again, we find minds that know things that they don't know they know. One striking example where brain damage has effects that seem to involve both attention and consciousness is known as neglect. Damage to the right hemisphere here especially the parietal lobe, often results in an attentional problem that causes people to neglect a whole side of visual space. They don't see anything on the left. It's right-sided damage controls the left. It's not a visual deficit as such, so they're not blind. You can get them to attend, but it's difficult. They simply ignore things that are happening there. So if you wave a $20 bill on the left side of one of these patients, they won't respond at all. They leave the food on half their plate. If you ask them to copy pictures, so they were shown the pictures on the left and asked to copy them, these are the copies on the right that one patient made. He was quite unaware that he was leaving out half the picture. These are paintings by a neglect patient as he recovered over time. So he started out with the top left picture, leaving out, they're self-portraits. So you can see. A straightforward explanation might be that attention can't get over to that side of space anymore, that the left is somehow just unattended. But the straightforward explanation soon runs into some difficulty. So if you show a picture through a slit like this, okay, did you all see that? Here it is without the slit. The interesting thing was that the patients who looked at this, their attention is right on a single slit in the center, but they still neglected the left half of the camel. So they
even when passing?
Yeah. They built the picture up in time. They're converting time into space and neglecting the left half of that. So it's a complicated lesion. In order to do that, of course, they must first, in some sense, see the whole object so that they can suppress its left side. Another selective loss.
Attention to show Chile as an detu Mars. Now, is that the end? She thought that they would say the Parshukune, Tambekalia, the Turim Jenki, could Rodigora, and Nick Kandangamong Supuchazan, Tongomena, and it did to remain Dangi or the Chegamatia.
Another selective loss.
Just no humor. Remember Tangbayine, Chega, young one, that Supuchega go to Simbena. So, am I right in thinking that even when they are shown the camel through the slit, where it's passing through, they still fail to see the left half?
Yes, they suppress the left half.
What about if they look at a small dot, like the?
They can't neglect the left. No, they would see they'd either see the dot or not see it.
Yeah.
I don't think they divide a dot in half. Yes, you could make it bigger and bigger.
Is there a sense, is there an understanding how large size do you need
a good question.
Before they start chopping it off?
Very good question. You'd make a good psychologist. So here's another patient. She had damage to the occipital and temporal lobes, and this made her unable to identify objects at all, not just on the left, or even simple lines and orientations. She couldn't tell whether a line was upright or horizontal. But when you gave her a card and asked her to post it through a slit, as here, she had no difficulty orienting the card in the right direction to get it through the slit. So she was clearly identifying the orientation in order to make her hand work correctly, but she couldn't tell you it's horizontal, not vertical. I once saw a video of another patient who was shown a picture. He had the same difficulty with recognizing objects. He was asked, "What's this?" And he didn't know, hummed and hawed. He said, "Is it a pencil?" But meanwhile, his fingers were doing this. He was playing the clarinet. So again,
you don't know that you know.
So
무슨이 루슬라고 그래요 거.
다 가르에서 라면은 랍도 깨지 시에나 베나 틱
탄년을 먹었어요.
단열 뭐 말이야. 단열사 말이야. 베나 디 이공루지 발수 동버잖아. 동버데 두테 흉을 여버다. 테를 여버디 임지산 땅 동문도 와.
네.
여머도 이게 지루가 땅 보이나?
신고.
그 루트고요. 근데 누가 그 쩨베 돈에 신경 여버 남들 때. 아니야 로기 남이 지나한테 지도걸 신경 매배.
Yeah.
네, 괜찮아요.
This is a very strange
It is, yes. This is it's very strange. This is another example where his hands seem to know something that his
Yes.
mind does not know.
맞아요. 안들 류 다가서도 세시었는데 걔 말하다.
말해.
그런
말해.
욕으로 봐.
말해.
또 그런 거는 그 문제면 해서 줘.
But the thing is, even to do this gesture, there has to be some intent,
모티베이션
thought
Yes.
behind it,
Yes.
which would suggest that there is some knowledge.
Yes, oh yes.
You know, what
The
it
is.
knowledge is there in the
Yeah.
brain somewhere. And it gets to the hands, but it doesn't get to the conscious mind.
The Quran is 신기요보다 Quran 신기매매 소리지.
This is exactly what you're referring to as implicit knowledge.
Yes, this is implicit knowledge.
수수도 신기요보다 마신부 소리지.
There are many other examples. I don't have time to give them, but it is a very surprising set of facts, set of findings that we need to take account of, I think, in trying to explain the brain. To fit it to our Western models is not easy. So I think this is one of the big discoveries about the brain, that is its degree of specialization, how information can be in one part of the brain and not accessible to another part, not accessible to the conscious part or the verbal part. There seem to be areas that specialize in recognizing faces, houses, in controlling hand movements, in storing locations, in retrieving words from our mental dictionaries. I mean, really a dispersal of many, many different functions in different parts of the brain. And I think these findings have produced fairly profound changes in our understanding of the mind. We think of ourselves as unitary identities. So we either see the pencil or the clarinet, or we don't see it. But patients cast some doubt on this unitary notion of the individual. We sometimes...
또베디 링구리스는 가져오래. 뭔지 못 붙여.
네.
이제 류식이 지금이 남준의 그 링구를 고마게 좀 미지도 와.
네. So would you say that the person who is shown the clarinet, and although he is not able to identify the object, but is showing the gestures, was he a musician, so that there is a familiarity?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. That might make a difference.
It might, certainly, yes. Yes.
그 발언이지.
네.
건배 발언이지.
네.
그 류식 때 리액션을 해.
But I think it still poses a problem, even if he was a musician. I don't know if this patient was.
그래. 그 발언이 되게.
Because if he was a musician, then because of the familiarity, then one would expect there is some form of subconscious level of knowledge that may immediately react in the bodily behavior.
But there are, I think, many other examples where it doesn't depend too much on familiarity.
가.
Also occasion where you might have seen many times.
You see it too, yes.
So there is a lot of strong habituation to the familiarity with the object.
Yes, that certainly has an effect, yes. But
you see other people playing.
you see people. Yes, yeah, I don't know, that's not probably an instrument that is used in India. But in the West, of course, he was familiar with the clarinet. Yeah. So we sometimes use a metaphor for the mind as being an organization, maybe something like the United Nations, where lots of information is floating around in different offices, different files, not all of it is accessible to everyone. When would we say that the United Nations knows something? I think it's almost analogous to the mind. Would we say the United Nations knows it when Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, knows it? Or if some lowly clerk somewhere in an office knows it, or if the information is in a file somewhere in the building. And I think the same kind of dilemma may apply to the mind. It functions like a kind of organization of semi-independent pathways and processes, using different subsets of information to do different tasks and using them in different ways. The set that becomes conscious may be those that make a coherent, organized story about what is happening to us, bringing together selected relevant information from many different specialized subsystems, but leaving the detailed evidence for those conclusions and the detailed implementation of the selected actions to unconscious processes. This evidence of the mental processes can sometimes be unconscious, I think raises some interesting questions about meditation. Is this view compatible with the Buddhist view of the mind as a multiple set of mental processes? I think it may be.
Meditators now, or is there no time? Yeah, that's fine. It's compatible.
Yes, we can bring it up in the discussion again, yes. In the last part of my talk, I was going to describe a few studies that we did of attention tasks in people who were adept meditators who had practiced many hours. Some of them were Buddhist monks. One actually was Mathieu. We chose 4 different tasks that showed dramatic limits to attention in normal people, and we wondered whether the meditators would show any differences in the tasks. I will summarize briefly because there's no time to go into a lot of detail, but in one experiment we asked people to do a search task which required binding. So look for the green X. Normal people take time to find it. They have to look at each item in turn. Would the Buddhist monks, would the people with meditation practice find it more quickly? The answer is no, they didn't. But the next task was more interesting. It's known, these were the results. It's known as the attentional blink, and I'll explain it in a moment here. The attentional blink, I showed you something similar with my stream of pictures where you were looking for an animal. In this task, you're looking for 2 targets in succession, so maybe 2 animals. We vary how far apart in time they are. So how soon does target 2 come after target 1? And what we find with normal people is that they are very likely to miss target 2 if they've just detected target 1. It keeps them busy. It grabs their attention, focuses them on that, and they lose target 2. The question is, would that happen with the meditators? So this is a graph of normal people. They're only getting about 20% correct when target 2 immediately follows target 1. And it gradually recovers as the interval gets longer. Here are the meditators. They were actually very much better. This is when they were in the state of open presence. They were doing that kind of meditation. And they found it a lot better. There are some other interesting exceptions to the attentional blink in normal people. They throw some light on why the meditators might also show this effect. In the first, people watched moving dots. So they watched the pictures, and then around them there were dots moving outward, like this, expanding. And they showed much less attentional blink. They looked more like the meditators than like the normal people. If the dots were moving inward, contracting, focusing you, they didn't show any benefit. So expanding, distributing attention seems to give you a better ability to detect targets. Another exception was when there was music playing in the background while the search through the letters was performed. Again, the attentional blink was considerably reduced by the music. I think, again, this kind of relaxes you, spreads attention more broadly, and allows you to detect targets without being grabbed, focused inward by the first target. And another interesting finding was that when people are happy, they naturally spread attention more globally, whereas when they're sad, they use a narrow focus. So in one experiment, people were shown stimuli like this, which made them happy, or else they were shown stimuli that made them sad, which I won't show you because I don't want to make you sad. And again, they were better after seeing these happy pictures than the sad ones. Again, perhaps relaxation induces a more global allocation of attention. The next test we used on meditators was a change detection task. So you show a picture like this, and it's going to alternate with another picture which is the same except for one change. Can you see the change, Your Holiness?
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to stare for a very long time before seeing it. It's actually this is coming and going.
Yes.
We wondered whether the meditators would be better at spotting the change than non-meditators, and I'm again afraid the answer was no. And finally, we looked at visual constancy. This relates to the sensory.
Attentional blink, attentional blinks of Jugalia. The par chipa tampo chikten, nibos beshuku tenja, munzi chia slavena, that Tuzuka Tungan Angul Tembena, Munzi chia de commission to Jotos, and the commission to Chik Munzi Beshuku Lamsa, de Toma Javache, Lochinda Poet, Mururchin, the Kibarishas, Chinda Mambuchali Kibandumundus.
I'll just quickly show this one because I think it relates to the question about sensory versus conceptual. So when you look at this picture and I ask you to compare the two squares labeled A and B, can you see them in the picture?
Yeah.
Are they the same color or different color? They, I think, to everybody look a different color. Actually, there they are when you take away the surrounding. And we wondered whether meditators would be able to abstract that better than normal people. We actually used this picture as well. Again, the monster that comes second looks much larger than the monster that comes first because of the perspective cues. It's actually exactly the same size.
Same size, really.
Same size, yes.
Right.
So we asked people, what size is it on the page? You know, in inches or centimeters. You don't believe me? And again, the meditators were no more able to.
His Holiness was saying that if you shift the perspective, then
yeah, if you look at you might be able to get it. Yes. Yeah. If you can suppress the surroundings, you can do it. I can more or less do that, but the meditators were not really able to do it. This is in a neutral state, and this is in meditative state, and there's really not much difference between the two. Okay, I think I'll stop at this point. We'll raise the questions during the discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much. So we have thank you very much, Anne. We have a 15-minute break, and I would like to ask you to come back in time. Thank you. Part that Professor Triesman was presenting about the parts that were not functioning, such as the left and right area or the recognition, that obviously triggered some thoughts in you. And please, would you mind?
I don't know. Listen. Say, more sort of what say.
Explanation.
I will say, what say, explanation out of your experiment or their experiment.
Research now.
Or more confusion. So nothing to say. But one thing, yesterday also I mentioned, as a result of our sort of say, dialogue or discussion, we Tibetan scholars, I think including practitioners sort of the experience, hopefully more serious discussion, and then if possible, some new sort of the
understanding.
New understanding. I think that's really worthwhile. So some young professors or kishis now here, I think one drawback is we study quite rigorously, but we contented just what this text said. Beyond that, up to now, nobody take new initiatives already. Shumne sheshava, that titus is right. That didn't so soon.
So one problem on the part of the current monastic establishment approach is that there seems to be a sense of contentment with what the level of understanding based in the text on the text, but we need probably complacency, and so we need to move beyond the level of understanding based on study, but to the next level, which is the understanding based on critical reflection. So there needs to be new initiative taken.
Then maybe perhaps just information regarding mind, including emotions. Usually, you see, we information about these subjects mainly from sutra side.
Sutra.
Sutra side. And within the sutra, the explanation, or I think definition, right?
Definitions
of mind, there are differences. The Vivashe, Sudantek, and Chidamantra, and Madhyamika. I think Madhyamika, particularly the Prasangika Madhyamika. Then, but all these is dealing with grosser level of mind only. So now, for example, yesterday, at a certain experience or of the mind at the dream time. There are in Tantric some information, like in Guhisamantra and Nagarjuna's Rimgenar.
5 stages, the text.
Clearly mentioned Lu Rakwa Chao Shindu Chao, Sem Rakwa Chao Shindu Chao, Chigdua.
So in the Vajrayana text in particular, there are recognitions, for example, in Nagarjuna's text, the 5 stages, he speaks about different levels of subtlety of body, the gross level of body, subtle and extremely subtle level of body. Similarly, in the mental domain as well, gross level of mind and consciousness, subtle level and extremely subtle level.
So, usual explanation or definition of these, say, different minds,
mental faculties, different mental faculties.
According to those Sutriyana. So that I quite sure you cannot sort of take
apply it. No.
Definition when we explain this subtle mind. So therefore, I think obviously through our daily experience, I depend now. The chinel chashavina, the Gulaman al Disumdoa, Nanga, Lung, Me, Chu, Sa. Junirbati, Giverbati, Tiberbati, Sa, Chu, Me, Lung, Nanga. Chi Juni Dridua. 当然是用现在在那边社区美容是现在在呢，俺这能就啥些，可是啥些吃不啥，练习我出赛着了吧？对用就干配上等个嘛都，用就个用人干下边呢，就差不多些。当然俺这的啥出美容哪个是现在在呢？他们不能哪个上来就在呢？社区美容给最用过吧？ 이는 난가 사지셔야 되거든. 자, 근데 이제 전에 그 중dur 뭐 락베 남샤티 중어 차가 따다 배주가 아이나 삼차. 와, 딱고 기름지체. 팀림지체. 또 디감도 되고. 딱 뒤는신 나 셰베간 치면이네. 라고 루브르 셰베디리 바바바 냐를 공내 셰바. 근데 봐지는 이루 애니 일로 차차차 차를 신제 다만 이니 동보숨신이 터도 회사 간다 되기도 봐. 주 계열 뭐 뒤에 다가로야. 자, 단 중어 시행도 전에 중어라 치 중어 난기 중어 난기 중어라 중어 차라. 중어 처음 시행도 전에 룽컴 강 시행도 룽의 생각을 강 시행도. 세상 가서 안다 난갈래 룽 세대한테 타지도 하고 놓는 게 상담도 봐. 그 에너지가 배지도 되기도 봐. 그다지 아주 빅방 쉐어하고 따다도 봐. 그봐. 도망에 스페이스죠. 그다. 다디 나로네 에너지 쉽실레인 거 봐. 그봐. 익스플로스. 요한 코라 에너지 쉽죠. 봐. 다 룽셴도 봐. 되네 메디레버 봐. 익스플로션 수준은 매요. 난가 룽메 따다도 봐. 다지는 마찬가지네. 근데 갈리갈리야. 출리야. 될때는 살이야. 따다도 봐. 자, 치 디넌시체니 난기 셰바 차라리 이리 두슨 저 되는지 아는 것이 아들이 자 다디리야도 셰르자니 치 존디리 파 제윤 차차차차 차르파 또 유르자네 어머 다 셰바도 저지 룽스도 저지 샤공이지 드라마샤나 군중기 왕기 두된라 뇌지지된다 주지지된 니샤윤자네 다 뇌지지된기 짜 좀시야 셰윤자네 대 주지지된기 가다 군중의 저요가 잘 모르다. 또 자, 다 디샤윤도 배녀 사오리샤. 배녀 사오리. 저다 롱의 생각에 관해 상담을 이나 상담도 와. 자, 이제 인도 군중어샤윤도 전에 참여관 야도 못해야지. 이게 중어라고 남샤 인도 줘야 되는 말이지. 다 시발레 나라 좀 뭐수다 용돼야지. 세븐 니그 시바. 다 니르기 내고 시바. 뒤는 좋다 연구도가. 봐. 야, 밀음기 내고 시바. 뒤 연구도가. 다 시두기 내고 시바. 아는 아주 연구소야 말이지. 지금 시가 적어주는 배시체 수마서는 걸어줘라. 한다. 롱주 글럽지 사줘야지. 도스. 이 회사 나오셔야지. 애도 거의 도이에도 시도야. 자사가 저들 이들 자데 치는 내고 시바가 가져야 돼. 뭐도 주니 시야 조금들이 밀림은 내고 시바 때가 시야 도도 와. 용도도. 시바 차라리 친도. 다 밀림은 내고 시바서 내리잖아요. 공해 시발이야. 오물로 그 뒤금도가 밀음은 내고 려고 시바 가스를 잡아. 그다 다 뒤로 그 시바 차지 가지고 와. 저저 점점에 아다 치료매에 별이야 밀음 거 돼야지. 대바 된자리. 가슴 게 로즈 주문은 시 밀음 양손님의 그도기 밀음 내가 최지집의 수기 융아 징에게 로테다 진지 로테다 디 남빈이부디 폐지 텐신명이 없이 폐지 지시 니디 예배인들라 밀음디 알아 밀음 니디 가르나 밀음디 용구마래 담이 밀음 매베 내가 시바다 용구래야 그봐 자 드린 일이잖아요 거다 시바 차로 치면 내가 남샤디 일이 아주 시바 락베 라고도 집에 남샤디 누가 아유 삼천기 다 드지 shum사고 요 말에 그래서 딱고 님식 쇼와래도 제가 저 기시서 비교슈기
I'd like to you're really the pro here. Just for our scientists here, when His Holiness is referring to Sutrayana, Tantrayana, is that completely alien to you, or do you have the framework for it? Why don't I add a preamble? Because this is a lot of Buddhist terminology. His Holiness spoke of Vaibhashika, Satrantic, and so forth. In the broad framework, this is not going to be a long talk, but there's a whole context of theory and practice within Buddhism, and this is now Tibetan Buddhism, which is called Sutrayana. It's called the exoteric, the basic foundational kind of mainstream bricks and mortar of Buddhism. And in that context, you don't get all of the subtleties that might be relevant to Anne's presentation today. On the basis of that, though, then there's this more esoteric whole genre. It's a very vast genre of theory and practice called Vajrayana. Within that context, you find Dzogchen, which is also referred to the Great Perfection, which Matthew has a lot of we have many experts here. In that context, then you have a lot of subtleties here. Of course, subtle and very subtle, body and mind, and so there may be more relevance there. And so, but that was the broader context. So the Tantrayana or Vajrayana, this is a whole genre that is more subtle, more esoteric, and not so publicly displayed. It's considered a bit more, how do you say, a bit private, right? So then I turn it over to Jimbala. But that was just the broad context for these contexts.
So the point His Holiness was making is that if you look at the Buddhist understanding of the origination of the material world, there is a sequence that is explained of emerging of the world from empty space. So in terms of the process of the emergence of 5 elements, including the space. So from space arises the wind element, from wind, fire, and water and earth. And so the...
I think wind, I think it means some kind of energy.
Energy, no. So similarly, when the physical world dissolves, then the reversal process happens. So from the grosser to the subtle, it dissolves until to the point of space. So kind of in a broad sense, this process of evolution seems to be quite similar to the basic Big Bang notion of matter coming out of nothing and then emerging in the form of an explosion leading to this extreme heat. So, which is preceded by this intense energy, dense energy. So the point His Holiness is making is that when we understand these processes in terms of these 5 elements, then we cannot understand the nature of these elements by using definitions of elements which are really applicable in the gross manifest context. So we cannot say the energy that is, the wind that is present in the initial stage is the same wind that we experience with the air and so on. So similarly, when we talk about different levels of consciousness, many of the definitions and characteristics and functions that are described of the various... No, so in Buddhist philosophy, distinctions made between basic elements and the derivatives emerging out of these elements, so which are properties emerging from these elements. So the properties emerging out of these elements are more gross and more perceptible compared to the natural, basic elements. So in the same way, so if you look at the Buddhist account of various mental states and mental factors and faculties and so on, the main discussion of these, a more systematic and comprehensive discussion of these, are really found in the Sutrayana context, where the definitions are really based upon understanding what in the Buddhist language, Tibetan Buddhist language, would call the grosser levels of mind. So the point His Holiness is making is that the definition... No, into Tibetan.
No, Nalanda scholar. These scholars, their terminology. Rakwatsudwa.
So it's Indo-Tibetan. I mean, in the technical scholarly world, we call it Indo-Tibetan Buddhism because the root is really from Nalanda.
And I think
But Pepe invention mare chikdiya.
I'm going to defend Jimbala, and that is the only place this whole system is practiced now is in Tibetan Buddhism and the derivative in Bhutan and so forth. But His Holiness is making the point it's rooted in India, classical India, and the great university systems such as Nalanda. So it's truly Indian, but it no longer exists in India, except for the Tibetans having come
Right.
back. So in that sense, you can say it's Tibetan because
Okay,
that's what's living
okay.
now.
So
Tibetan Buddhism does not mean
Tibetan
our
English.
own creation.
No.
Or
Indo-Tibetan.
as a Lamaism.
But Your
One
Holiness,
Lama
Yeah.
may not very, very really authentic, but the show is great. And then say something. And emphasis importance of Guru Yoga.
but Your Holiness,
Not that way,
in the
yeah.
Western scholarly discourse, we refer to it as Indo-Tibetan Buddhism.
Oh, that's good.
Indo-Tibetan
That's
Buddhism.
good.
So the point His Holiness was making is that so many of the more comprehensive, systematic account of the various mental states and mental faculties and factors are really found in texts that belong to this exoteric Sutrayana system, where the definitions and the descriptions of these mental states are really based upon grosser level of consciousness and mind, kind of ordinary mental states and so on. However, if you bring in the Vajrayana perspective, then there is a recognition of different levels of subtlety in consciousness, the grosser level, the subtle level, and extremely subtle level. And to some extent, all of us do experience these different levels of subtlety of consciousness. We are all aware of what dreaming feels like, what sleeping feels like. And compared to the waking state, awareness and consciousness and awareness during the dream state is subtler. Compared to that, the deep sleep state is subtler. And in fact, yesterday we had discussions about what is the nature of the dream objects, the relationship between the dreaming consciousness and the objects and so on. And in fact, historically, one major Mahayana Buddhist school, Chittamatra, has used the example of dream consciousness and its relation to object as an evidence to argue the unreality of external material objects. And the suggestion here is that just as dreaming consciousness and its content are simultaneous and in some sense inseparable, in the same manner when we perceive the world, the actual perception and what the content of that perception cannot be separated. They are basically of the same nature, so they have used that. So and then Buddhist Vajrayana tradition speaks of also the subtlest level of consciousness, which is the consciousness at the moment of death. Of course, that we cannot have experiential knowledge of this, and although there are some techniques in the Vajrayana tradition where a simulation of death can be affected, for example, by squeezing this jugular vein. But if you do it wrongly, you might not come back. So
Real experience. Real experience.
So the point is that on the part of the Indo-Tibetan tradition, there is all of these resources. But since the systematic account is really in the Sutrayana text, we need to find and there is no textual resources that explains how this can be integrated, and the definitions and the understanding of the consciousness can be broadened in a systematic way, bringing in the Vajrayana perspective. So here, probably we need more work.
Attention, that 거의 패지 로차라기 개발 패지하래.
So, for example, if we take one example of a mental faculty like attention, depending upon the subtlety of the consciousness, the moment of that cognition, again, how that attention operates may be very different.
Memories 듣는 개발이었어요.
The same thing goes for mindfulness faculty.
Memory.
Memory.
No. Mindfulness 리 패지 로차라고 왕기 패지 개발하고 했어요.
So again, here a faculty like mindfulness, depending upon the subtlety of the mind, one will have to, recognize different operations.
Mm-hmm. So since you brought more confusion in my mind, so my side, my responsibility is to bring more confusion.
남도 여보 좀 선사.
가.
남도 여보 좀 선사.
그래서那看不看都早进，那个所以呢，看不想个，所以他选到考不了是吧？他学习到了，他去没吧？
Yes, there's a Tibetan master from Kama, Dzogchen master. He once spoke about some people who seem to act as if they're very decisive, but there is no real decision.
Yes.
David, your questions, 30 seconds as we agreed.
Your Holiness, I have a question about the nature of subtle mind. So, is it possible or not for events that are taking place at the level of subtle mind to directly influence behavior in the gross body? For example, in the way that Professor Treisman was showing that a brain-damaged patient who could not perceive or at least not report the orientation of objects nevertheless could respond to those objects as if the patient in some sense deeply knew what the properties of those objects were. The question would be, might that kind of connection, according to Buddhist views, stem from communication between the subtle level and the gross level?
디페지면 하다. 네, 어떤 생각이 디페지면 무슨기? 아주 박자 사실 그게 뭔지 알아? 또막 삼담이나 시바 차차 강이야. 박자 거시지. 다 레벨 교수는 시바라고 이디기 차차를 뭔지 시바 레벨 땐데 요이사. 그다 방식 지고 말아. 다 시바 차야 강이야. 나그 공배 박자 요이 되지. 나 시바 진공도 균용은 시. 나도 뒤 박자를 비가야. 시바 처음부터 강이 요이 되지. 다 시바 차슈다매. 다 시바 차라면 요이 되잖아. 단 디스 말이야. 근데 맨로 삼천기. 너희 가서 박자를 쓰네. 되면두지 말해. 되면두지다. 도스 바보를 자시 걸어보다. 딱 그거 봐. 시험 사고 가는 시합이나. 다 레시비시고. 다 레시비시고 있네. 또고지네. 시험 영어지네. 다들 영어 가면 시비시고 다 레인 거 봐. 시고랑 가는 시사 시도 해나면. 가.
시고다 가고 싶으시죠?
어디 시고 가고 싶으시죠? 자자가 딱 가다 유제를 차는 그 유제 이모도 샤도. 그 지구 유제 이르잖아요. 시부 유제 이모도 다제도 그래. 뒤에서 잘해. 다 시비에 자시다는데. 그 시바 참여가 아니야. 그 박자샤 써야지. 나르기 다 녀지. 그게 박자샤 써야지. 시바 참여가는 마 패지 리기어리. 그래서 뒤에 이르잖아요. 라볼루블 시베 자와자 누구지 냐바이네. 시바 참여가는 박자 써야지 용도.
So, from the Buddhist point of view, listening to Anne's presentation, a lot of these phenomena will be explained on the basis of invoking the concept of what is called imprints or vasana. Vasana, right?
Habitual propensities.
Habitual propensities, vasanas. I don't know what the Pali term is.
Vasana.
Same, yeah. So it's a habit or kind of an imprint that has been formed as a result of prior experience or repetitive or several repetitions of experience. And when someone, for example, has a brain damage to that region, the expectation would be that if it has been imprinted, that these imprints will be stored in a subtler level of consciousness. So although as a result of the brain basis being damaged, grosser levels of mental activity may be damaged, but the subtle levels of operation still carries on, and then the imprint can affect the behavior. So that's how His Holiness was saying that he would understand the process working.
Whether it's really an act of knowing or not.
Yeah, but that's okay.
So I think our daily experience, when we had some sort of pleasant dream or fearful dream, the next day, although you know that's a dream, nothing. But somehow, some influence in our grosser level of mind. Last night, good dream, happy dream, next morning, feel happy, isn't it? Fearful dream, next day, little uncomfortable.
So we can see the effect of the activities at the subtle level of consciousness on the grosser level of consciousness as well, like from dream to the waking state.
I think the brain specialist, I think important to examine people who really faint. No longer these grosser level of consciousness now working, but not dead. Even breathing stop. So at that time, if it's possible to test in some part of their brain, the normal faint that still living.
So if you have situations where an individual has total loss of consciousness, but it's not dead, so all the normal operations of the brain...
It's not a total loss, it's just the coarser level. It's only that the subtle can still be there.
No.
That's what you, yes.
So all the normal operations of... So generally, for example, in the Vajrayana text, there's a recognition of specific... in one of the Guhyasamaja texts, recognition of specific occasions when a subtle, very subtler level of consciousness is experienced. For example, like when you faint or yawning.
Not most subtle, but some.
Comparatively subtle, yeah. Sneezing and of course death, and then sexual climax. So in the earlier historians were saying no, and then fainting. No. So for the neuroscientist, it may be interesting to see if there is a way of experimenting to see what's going on in the brain of someone who has lost total consciousness, but is not dead.
All done.
Please. Please, Anne. Yes, just.
There are recent reports.
Shiba. No, it's okay. It's okay. You can speak. It's not,
there's some recent reports of...
your microphone is okay. No, your microphone should be okay.
It's okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, you already have this one.
People in a state of vegetative consciousness where they are unable to make any contact with the world. It's a very important question, of course. Should we still continue to save them?
I need this.
Somehow that's not working. I'm sorry.
Okay. Should we continue to save them?
Sure.
And so they tried using fMRI to see whether there was any signs of brain activity, and asked one patient, I think, to mentally walk through the rooms of his house or play tennis or something. I hope you'll correct me if I'm wrong. And found activity which looked very like the normal activity that was going on in this person who was quite unable to speak or to signal in any bodily way. So your experiment has recently been done.
So are they breathing?
Yes.
They're vegetative state. Vegetative state. So do they hear?
Well, I think they could hear because they could respond to this question.
They were unable to speak.
Yeah.
So they said to them, if your answer is yes, think about walking through the rooms of your house. So they used activity of the spatial system in the brain as the indication of a verbal yes from the patient, because the patient could not speak.
That's right. I think it doesn't apply to all patients in the vegetative state, but it can happen.
So to some extent, their auditory perception is functioning.
Yes.
Otherwise, there'd be no connection.
Yes.
So this would, from the Buddhist perspective, would not be deemed subtle consciousness, but still is operating on the coarse level, because all of the 5 physical senses are regarded as being in the category of coarse consciousness.
Someone in the audience mentioned the experiments about implicit memory and anesthesia. So when someone is totally unconscious, they still, memory processes, memorizing facts can still be.
So from the Buddhist point of view, the kind of unconsciousness brought about through anesthesia would be very different from the one that is experienced through a natural process of dissolution.
Through natural or through meditation?
Yeah.
For the vegetative state patient, until they came up with this procedure with fMRI, they were unable to show that any of the senses were working. So they couldn't tell that the patient could hear until they studied the brain. So for your normal way of seeing if somebody is sensing, they said no, he has no sensory abilities.
There was also a study published in The Lancet about 345 cases of people who have got heart attack, and for a few hours without a flat EEG, so NDE experience. And there was a number of recollection while having a flat electroencephalogram, which nobody could disprove. So some people say the stem brain and all that, but so it seems in that case the gross consciousness, according to Buddhist term, would be not functioning if the EEG is flat, and yet there were 5 or 6 undisputed cases of some kind of recollection.
Yes.
So for Your Holiness, what would be, from your point of view or from the Buddhist point of view, a real clear, subtle state of mind? There is obviously not clear where it actually is the threshold between being unconscious and still being able to perceive, which is...
So this is one of the geishis that His Holiness know, who is a good practitioner as well of Vajrayana, and so he had to go through...
A few of them, I asked.
So they had to go through, the surgery, which involves, global anesthesia. So they, some of them said that they were very curious to see whether, they could identify the dissolution processes that occur in a loss of consciousness. And they all said nothing was happening. So similarly, in His Holiness' own case,
I also
last
have
year...
now, it's the first person. Right.
Yeah, first person experience.
Last year, you see the surgery of the gallbladder. I also did that medicine.
So he had to take global anesthesia, and he was also quite curious to see whether these dissolution processes occur.
But attention said.
So he applied his attention as much as he could, but nothing was there.
I had the same experience.
So this is because it's being abruptly brought in. So that doesn't allow the natural process of dissolution to occur. So this seems to be quite a different form of unconsciousness.
Yes.
One peculiar case is that digital, yeah. Yeah, the young man today, Jargon today. The Chinese name too young. So that the young man, Chongda Jarba, the extent chung. Lulia. So that the Gao Jemade, Chambadi Shukche. You want legally my temperature, yeah, quite Jemat Gao Chandi, called a dog stick, because of combatment, Page Chang.
So another interesting kind of phenomenon is that among the people that who remember past lives, His Holiness knows two Indian.
Actually, I met two Indian girls, one in Parietal, one in Kambur. Very clear memory about past life. So both cases, is it because of the death,
the cause of death,
previous life, very certain.
Accident, yeah.
So you want to be much more so
it seems that from the Vajrayana point of view, they didn't have the chance to go through the normal dissolution of the elements. So this seems to leave a very stronger impact, so that people are able to recall their past life experience.
They both not practitioner, the previous life, just a young student. Of course, the physical also, I think, young age.
Young age.
Maybe some differences. So therefore, in order to recognize,
recognize
experience the next life,
reincarnation,
memory about past life, then better to die at a young age.
We have no hope, we're too old.
Yes.
One question that came up, at least for me, and you mentioned that in your talk, was that when there is a neglection of certain capacities, there is obviously a process that is somehow still remembering, or maybe it's a propensity that kind of resurfaces. And you mentioned as a sideline that there was a recovery also of certain capacities.
Yeah.
In regards to the left field.
Oh, the neglect yes.
of
often
the left field.
That recovers.
What triggers that recovery? Is there a process, or is it just a spontaneous, or is it kind of like a... You're on.
I'm on, okay.
Yeah.
I think time does a lot. So people recover spontaneously from many of the brain injuries. But also you can increase the recovery by training the patient to do tasks. And in some cases, they don't recover. But there is much more plasticity in the brain than people had assumed, and it is worth trying to get them to practice to do things, because a lot of recovery can occur.
At the end, some of your experience, everybody used to have this sort of experience. Tonight, you see, you can
set an intention.
Set intention. Now tomorrow, about 5 or 3, I must get up. So then, if you keep some kind of will, then although during sleep, no longer is that kind of the determination. Even at just before wake up, also you see no such sort of determination. But the yungdua.
So you are able to get up. Yeah. So how do you explain that?
You mean to get up at a certain time?
Yes, by setting up an intention.
Yes, I wish I knew. Some people can do it. My husband can, I can't.
Amishi, you might have an answer to that?
No, I definitely don't have an answer to that. But I actually do have a question. So a lot of the things that we were talking about today with Anne's presentation brought up aspects of our experience that we might not have awareness of. And it seems to me that a lot of the intention of contemplative practice is to become more and more aware of our experience. So the goal, in a sense, is to increase our attention and awareness. I wanted to ask you, Your Holiness, if there's any examples that you or others can mention to me of explicitly not wanting to have awareness. Which is not ignorance, but explicitly not wanting to bring your awareness to something.
Wishing not to be aware.
No.
Well, I'll give you an example. I mean, I have a 6-year-old son who sometimes he's playing a lot and will like bite his shirt or something. And he does some habit that if he keeps attending to it, he might get more and more captured to do it. So part of it is kind of encouraging him to not pay attention. There's certain aspects of our experience that may benefit from actively not attending to them. And I wanted to ask you if there's...
So it happens a lot now.
You want to explain what the mission is trying to...
She's saying is that there are occasions when we very specifically don't want to pay attention to something. And does that happen in Buddhism? I think for a monk will very specifically not pay attention to women as beautiful objects or parts of the body. Your eyes are down. And so you're very specifically not attending to objects that will arouse any kind of desire. Part of Buddhist monastic discipline. So this happens not a great deal. Or if something would make you very angry, not focusing on it to arouse the anger. It's not choosing ignorance, it's simply saying, I don't want that mental factor, therefore I will not focus on objects that will arouse craving, hostility. It's very common.
Please? Yeah, that's why I won't be caught up. 아들 지나를 왜 뛰어한다 꿀lun지 타네 따디 님이 통니 동기하러 와.
Then morang condition derecha. And presentation 나로야. 셰베게 자외릭 멍보지 가사 권하는 것도 좀 마주로 받던데. 용거 봤어. 근데 곰 그냥 랭그 톤에 가사 지라봐 규말에 뭔도 좀 맞도베 나 르가나 좀 멍보지 뭔도 좀 두고 요서레스. 디나야 공그리 가실이야 체도니네 미고 마데바 제제 근데 그렇게 요르베스
답변은 아주 안 돼요 다리 안에 겨우는 시키시도 되는구나 겨우는 시키시도 되는고요 얼마도 배랑 아주 미지가 저희네 체들이야 시부지고 고바치부 여대비진 이나 디 체멜이야 그 쪼아 마셔네 그 관배 슉되기 저 볼레면 줘 배는 먼지비지 체멜이야 디 님일 톤 껴도 통하지 배는 랑도 없는 시리 배는 약간 원고 도미할 지기 가서래 최근에 동기하르디 얘네 나만 슈슈 용대 하셔디 뭔지 박자가 돈다 되고 자다 디는 시체니 아주 경험이 시거보다 경험이 시기 비주산에 경험의 박자 슈디기 천들이야 믹스에다 두긴 저 대체 데모토야 지금 나만 슈슈 용대 하디 뭔지 박자가 안 되고 완전 심해요 그러나 보고시가 가서 직서 있어요 그래서 보고 순주 간에 부카셰 무수야 싶을까고 부카셰 런싱 무수야를 막아 네 어디 들어 다 뒤에 멋이 진간에 지가서다 피지컬 니즈토하는 대신 강점을 겹투고 그러지 얘네 차상시 패지 가고 그래 third factor 패지 고르 다들 바자간 거 다 이제 저기 개발하는데 그 주도 자식만 이거 육신데
So what His Holiness was saying that what Alan is referring to is a form of practice known as the restraining the door of the senses, which is an important part of the practice. But a lot of these phenomenon, the kind of example that you have given of your son, from the Buddhist point of view, be explained really from the point of view of the operation of the habit or the propensities or imprint. And of course that takes into account the existence of previous lives. And even in this lifetime, something that you have become very habituated to in the earlier part of our life, later on, if you need to restrain from it, it needs much more effortful exertion. But if you're not that habituated in your earlier part of the life, then when you want to refrain from it, it'll also be easier. So in Buddhism, a lot of these is explained on the basis of habituation and the imprints that are formed from the activities that have been done. And then, so of course, if you don't bring in the perspective of previous existence, then to some extent, these kind of phenomena may be explainable on the basis of environment and genetic. But from the Buddhist point of view, there will not be a complete explanation. So then we will have to accept that there is only a kind of an approximate level of explanation.
There's a third factor.
Yeah, third factor.
So, in the meantime, those people who don't care about previous life, they'll forget these things.
But my question wasn't about overcoming a habit.
Sure.
I mean, I'm sorry that I gave an example that maybe made it more confusing, but my question is really about, because in a sense, when you have to overcome a habit, that takes attention, that takes control, that takes an effort, a will, and that is a level of engagement. I'm asking if there's anything in which it's not resisting engagement, which in itself takes engagement, but if there's some way in which, or some instances in which cultivating the mind to not engage, to actively not become more aware, right? Because the solution to overcoming a habit is to become aware of it so that you can deal with it.
Oh, sorry. Hey,
Yes,
sure.
Mr. Komas, you want to explain what...
It was homeless.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Kurang se wongpo go tambas labine kanya chedunine ichi te ku garba ko chawadala majura tanda di digital yang kol mikpa te ku yorbas mikpa te mo ko acheje kana samlo kurang zan matang be tone yeje ne tapshe di ne yonas wongpo go tamba ine ko yan yimi samtang paja de ngon 가서 공부 등 건지
자, 패배 자와도 뇌배 자와. 집에나 개미기 롱어된 수명 그러와.
네.
롱어된 게 이렇게 잘해야 야 릭하셔. 믹스 년부터 벌써 이렇게 말 왔다고.
말해.
딱 그런 신기. 야다 쿨유다. 제대로 타네. 그 믹스에 가서다. 이게 저렇게 매체 그런 식도 시기야. 금실에 대한 걸로. 그러면 와. 그렇다.
Matthew,
you have
not quite clear because within the various mental states, from the ethical point of view, some of them will be virtuous, some of them will be non-virtuous, some of them will be ethically neutral. So many of the mental processes that we experience may be completely neutral from the ethical point of view. So in here, there's no case of applying antidotes or trying to suppress them.
And also, I think there may be a difference between non-engaging into something and trying to suppress your awareness about something. That's very different. I think in contemplative practice, there's not much about suppressing the awareness. It would not make sense. But if it's something that you don't want to engage in because of some reason, of the repercussion or the consequences of that, you don't necessarily have to suppress it from your consciousness. You just have not to engage in it. And that doesn't necessarily mean blockage or something. It could be simply not being affected by it. Like the kind of practices that maybe give more sort of space that you are noticing, but it doesn't have an impact. It doesn't trigger a chain reaction. So there's many different ways. You don't have necessarily to suppress everything or obliterate everything.
There are two approaches there very quickly, that if one is looking at a person for whom one is habituated to look at a certain type of people as objects of desire, that can be a very strong habit. And for a monk, that's not a good habit. You can do one of two things. You can, and as much as we said, it's not simply suppression. You're simply redirecting your attention elsewhere. That's one possibility. That it's not ignorance. You're redirecting your attention elsewhere. But also you may focus it. If you're mature in the practice, you may keep your attention right on the person who is an object of desire, and then shift your perspective on that person, no longer seeing the person as an object of desire, but as being like one's mother, one's sister, as a sentient being. Develop loving kindness, compassion, empathy. Now you can attend as long as you like, and it's no longer feeding desire, it's now feeding compassion and loving kindness. But if you're fairly, primitive in your practice, a beginner, you might find that very difficult, in which case you simply keep your eyes down or redirect your attention elsewhere to something that won't feed the flames of your mental affliction.
Liz, you had a question?
I was going to make a point, following up on Amishi's point, which is that attention, one of the characteristics of attention is that it's limited capacity. So choosing to focus on something is by definition choosing not to focus on something else. I think this is the point that Matthew got to. So it's not necessarily the case that you are, by choosing to engage in a meditative practice, you're choosing not to engage with something else. And it's not a choice to avoid necessarily. It's just choosing one path of attention.
Can I follow up on that?
Yeah.
Was going to mention the same idea, and it brings up a question for Anne about the houses and the faces, because if we're focusing on we can come at this in two different ways. If we're focusing on the faces, then the houses are in the background, and we're not focusing, so we're not attending to the houses. But you want to say that the brain is attending to the houses in some way.
Up to some level, yeah.
But then there's a lot of other things going on in the brain at the same time. So there are processes. You can say the brain is processing information about the houses, and perhaps the brain is processing information about heartbeat, respiration, and other things going on. But we wouldn't say that the brain is attending to the heartbeat. I mean, the use of the word attention in that sense.
No, I was not suggesting it was. I'm saying that even when you're not attending, even when your attention is devoted to the faces, which pretty much used up all that they had, there is still some perceptual processing going on, but of which we're unaware. So that was the point I was trying to make.
And you wouldn't call that attention?
No, not really.
I think this is a good point to break for lunch. We convene again at 1 o'clock. Thank you very much, Your Holiness. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.